Thank you for coming today. This press conference is being held at the Rocky Flats site of the former nuclear weapons plant. We hoped that when the Soviet Union fell, that the probability of nuclear war would go way down. But we are at the highest level of nuclear war risk ever, according to both the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and the intelligence officers and experts who completed the probability of collapse model update survey. Russian use of nuclear weapons in Europe is likely and could quickly escalate from battlefield use in Ukraine to strikes on NATO targets supporting Ukraine with long range weapons, and even to a strategic exchange between the United States and Russia. The doomsday clock is at its closest ever countdown to nuclear war apocalypse, and artificial intelligence will likely yield new, much easier ways to enrich uranium and make nuclear weapons. Russia has abandoned nuclear reduction and test ban treaties, made repeated threats to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, and NATO countries supplying weapons to Ukraine, and a Russian attack of NATO would demand U.S. nuclear attacks on Russia, according to U.S. nuclear doctrine. The congressionally funded and chartered EMP Commission estimated that if Russia, China, or even North Korea detonates just one or two nuclear weapons at high altitude over the United States, the destruction of the U.S. electric grid could lead to the death of 90% of Americans. My qualifications to speak to you on collapse threats are laid out here. We've given you the paper copies of these slides that I'm briefing now, so I'm going to move through them fairly quickly and then take questions. The destructive power of individuals continues to skyrocket, whether it's developing and releasing a deadly virus that kills billions, executing a cyber attack that takes down the electric grid, or a rapidly growing list of new ways to kill people and trigger a collapse. Individuals increasingly have unprecedented power to cause destruction and damage that took a large group or a nation state in the past. A terrorist or nation state, or even one dedicated individual, can take existing technology like CRISPR, which you can use for just a few $1,000s, and design a new virus or modify an existing virus to more effectively kill humans. The situation is getting much worse because every existing technology can now be made more lethal by bad people employing artificial intelligence to develop more efficient means of killing people and escaping countermeasures. Long before AI and robots reach a stage of artificial general intelligence, where AI systems develop a self preservation instinct, AI will be used by bad people to kill off billions or most of humanity. You can be 100% confident of this. AI is being used now to develop better drugs to save lives, and AI is being used by bad countries and terrorists to develop deadly new viruses. The frequent warnings about artificial intelligence are valid, but understate the AI threat. While bad computers and bad robots could indeed trigger a collapse and kill out most humans, the biggest threat of AI is bad people using AI now to design more effective ways to kill. For example, the Collapse Survivor app ran a realistic training exercise scenario where AI was used to develop easier, faster ways to enrich uranium and develop nuclear weapons. It is absolutely inevitable that bad countries, terrorist groups, and bad individuals will use AI and biotechnology to develop highly contagious, deadly new viruses. Artificial intelligence is not a future threat, it is a current collapse threat. AI can figure out completely new ways to kill that humans would never think of. That is why AI defeated the best player in the ancient game of Go. The AI pursued strategies and tactics that in thousands of years humans had never come up with, but proved superior. That is why you see rich people and CEOs of tech companies building private security bunkers, not just in the US, but in New Zealand and all over the world. They recognize that we have entered the age of collapse, and there is no way to put all these technologies and AI back in the bottle. Can it get worse? Sure, just add quantum computers and increase the power of AI even more to develop new ways to destroy life. Despite decades of government reports warning that the U.S. electric grid is very fragile and vulnerable to attack, it remains unhardened, unprotected. Our electric system can be destroyed by solar flares, cyber attacks, physical attacks, or nuclear attacks that today even a small nuclear power like North Korea can execute. Advances in biotechnology, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, cyber, and many other new technologies now give a small group or even an individual the capability to kill billions, starting a disaster that can shut down the economy, stop food distribution, and lead to a collapse that includes widespread loss of law and order as starving people steal and kill to survive. We are increasingly vulnerable to pandemics and huge casualties when there is any disruption to normal economic activity because of rising overpopulation. Our economic system is more complex, more globally interdependent, more vulnerable to disruptions. There are at least 1 million gang members in the United States, 2 million Americans in prison who will get out when there is a collapse and start marauding. Whether it's a virus or economic disruption or some other disaster that triggers a collapse, it's the loss of law and order, the looting and marauding, the starvation, and the cascading effects of the initial disaster that is most likely to kill people. A big change over the past decade is that populations are more vulnerable to collapse. There's a higher percentage of urban dwellers dependent on long distance shipments of food and fragile water systems that a cyber or grid attack can destroy. Fewer people have basic survival, gardening, hunting, staying alive skills. Our long distance shipping of food, municipal water systems that must have electricity to operate, a just in time delivery economy with international sourcing makes us extremely vulnerable to even short term disruptions and sets us up for a disaster and a collapse. When a disaster hits, grocery stores will be looted in the first few hours. Law and order will quickly vanish in cities and eventually everywhere. Food truck drivers will quickly realize it's not safe for them to drive into cities. Even in Katrina, which should have been a mild disaster, the violence, the looting, and the marauding scared truck drivers, and many refused to go into New Orleans without military troop escorts. When people face starvation, they will kill, and if necessarily, they will steal, and if necessary, kill to survive. We have largely eliminated inventories. Even hospitals maintain only small inventories of vital drugs. When a pandemic hits, few people will report for work, and those that do, like policemen, will catch the virus and die. For a few days, people will survive on food and water in their home, then many without will start going out to steal and maraud to survive. An important point to understand is that the trigger event is often not what will immediately cause the collapse, but the cascading effects, the panic, the marauding by bad people or desperate starving people that can lead to economic shutdown and loss of law and order. Here is the bottom line in this slide on trends in new technologies, threats, and our fragile economy and society. The destructive power of individuals continues to skyrocket, whether it's developing and releasing a deadly virus that kills billions, executing a cyber attack that takes down the electric grid, using AI to develop a new poison for municipal water systems, or some other way to kill people in new ways we haven't thought of. Individuals have unprecedented power to cause destruction and damage, and it's far easier to disrupt and cripple our modern, integrated, complex, dependent, fragile economy than a local, agricultural based economy. Any big public protest or surge in looting, and police are overwhelmed. Law and order can quickly vanish. If a nuclear power plant does not have its workers coming to work because they are afraid to leave their family home because of the marauder risks, then you can have nuclear power plants melt down, radiation release disasters. If society breaks down, it may not come back for a long time. We don't have pioneers anymore. We have people specialized in skills and work that is worthless in a collapse situation, not farmers, but dependent city and suburban dwellers with poor survival skills, few local resources, and who will be dead in 3 days without water and 30 days without food. I developed this probability of collapse model when I was working at the Institute for Defense Analyses, the top Department of Defense federally funded R&D center or think tank, and I presented it at the Military Operations Research Society Symposium a decade ago. This summer, I worked with threat experts to update this model that estimates the annual likelihood of a collapse disaster occurring. There are now more trigger events that could lead to a collapse, such as a domestic civil war, that we didn't consider a decade ago. We now track 49 different collapse risks. Most of these events are highly uncertain, and we have no past statistical record to estimate their likelihood. So experts are asked to estimate the likelihood of both one, does the trigger event occur? And then two, whether or not that trigger disaster escalates to a level that could cause a collapse. We cannot calculate the probability of a collapse from past occurrence data, but we can by assessing the risks, working with experts, and that's how this model works to estimate the annual probability of a collapse occurring. A severe disaster may occur, but it may not have widespread impact and it may not escalate into a collapse level disaster. This model weighs both the likelihood that the initial trigger disaster occurs and then it estimates the likelihood of that spreading and escalating to a collapse level disaster where economic activity largely ceases and there is widespread loss of law and order, society breaks down. You cannot reasonably estimate the annual likelihood of a collapse by just looking at the likelihood of a disaster trigger event like a pandemic or a domestic civil war. You also have to consider whether or not the breakdown in law and order spreads to a wide area and how people react. Do large numbers of bad people exploit the disaster to loot and maraud? Does panic and violence spread and escalate to a point that it disrupts economic activity and food availability? Do normally good, well behaved people, afraid that they might starve to death, go out and start marauding, stealing, and killing to get food to survive? Katrina illustrated the potential for crime, looting, violence post disaster, and risks that police will abandon their posts when threatened. The probability of collapse model estimates, again, both the likelihood that an initial trigger disaster event will happen and then whether it will expand and escalate into a collapse. The current estimate covers several new technologies and trigger events, including a U.S. domestic civil war. The model is just updated based on inputs from intelligence officers, scientists, biologists, defense analysts, and other experts familiar with the threats. The original probability of collapse model estimate over a decade ago was a 1 to 21% annual likelihood of a collapse. The probability of collapse model now estimates a 16 to 57% annual likelihood of a collapse. Advances in biotechnology, artificial intelligence, the higher likelihood of a nuclear attack, especially one that takes down the electric grid, and civil war were the major drivers of the large increase in the likelihood of a collapse. We rated these 49 trigger events that could lead to a collapse. The probability of nuclear weapons use is at a record high. Experts in biotechnology say that it is inevitable that we will experience a bioengineered pandemic. The vulnerable U.S. electric grid could be destroyed by physical attacks, solar flares, cyber attacks, or a nuclear attack that even a country with a small, inaccurate nuclear arsenal could deliver. Natural threats like a supervolcano eruption, asteroid strikes, a natural pandemic, or a devastating crop virus, and many others are still with us. The threat of any one disaster event may be low, but with so many means of triggering a collapse disaster, it is not surprising that the cumulative probability of a collapse is high. With increasing overpopulation and the increasing complexity and fragility of our economy, and people who are increasingly urban, dependent on long distance food and water, and a highly politically divided society today, the result is a much higher likelihood of a deadly collapse. While some naturally occurring threats have some strong basis for estimation, there is no statistical basis to estimate most threats. So again, we use expert subjective estimates. We ask experts to estimate both high and low values because there is so much uncertainty. But unpredictability and uncertainty does not mean low probability. The range in estimates from high to low are huge because we can't reliably estimate the probability of occurrence in the future for most of these threats, and we certainly have no confidence in how people will react, how the economic effects will ricochet through the economy, how different nations and gangs and individuals will behave when things are going to hell. Add to this the uncertainties of new technologies that are growing so rapidly, and you clearly have an unpredictable stew of troubles. But the best estimates of experts and a rational, careful analysis of the risk and a cataloging of all these threats, which is what the probability of collapse model does, gives you a very, very good insight into the overall likelihood of a collapse. The key point is not 16% or 57% likelihood. The key point is that the likelihood of a collapse is high, not low. We are going to have horrible pandemics, orders of magnitude worse than COVID-19. And the likelihood of a collapse is rising because of new technologies that raise the destructive powers of individuals, coupled with an increasingly complex, vulnerable economy and population. In this slide, in addition to giving you the low and high estimates of a collapse, I've also listed the estimated probability of a disaster trigger event occurring during the year. Again, a disaster trigger event may occur but not escalate into a collapse. The annual likelihood of a collapse is 16 to 57%, but the annual likelihood of a disaster trigger event, our experts estimated at 55 to 100% every year. Using the low probability of the disaster trigger event and the average estimated likelihood that that particular disaster would spread and escalate, resulting in a collapse, we rank ordered the 49 threats that are most likely to cause a collapse. Number one was the domestic civil war, which we'll address in more detail later. There is a 2% low risk estimate of a civil war that leads to a collapse, and a 5% high risk estimate of some type of civil war that is so violent and widespread that it leads to a collapse. When we get to questions, I can go through more of the particular disaster threats listed on this slide if you'd like. Because some collapse disasters have multiple trigger events, it's more useful to group the trigger events for things like a pandemic or a collapse due to destruction of the electric grid. When you do this, you find these results as the top 5 collapse risks. Number 1 is electric grid destruction. Pandemics are number 2. A domestic civil war is the 3rd most likely collapse. Societal breakdown from other causes is 4th. And nuclear attacks severe enough to cause a collapse are the 5th most likely collapse disaster we face. Our electric grid is very vulnerable and fragile. It could be taken down by solar flares, physical attacks, cyber attacks, or a nuclear weapon EMP attack. Pandemics can be from natural mutations, from an accidental lab release, or a deliberate bio-attack by a nation state, a terrorist group, or a dedicated lone wolf fanatic who modifies H5N1 or some other virus with bioengineering to develop a deadly new virus and cause a pandemic. With the U.S. electric grid destroyed, it's going to plunge us into a disaster that will likely kill 90% of the population. We have a fragile, very vulnerable electric grid that can be taken down by many means, as we've mentioned. Even North Korea, with an inaccurate small nuclear force, has the means to destroy the United States of America. A Congressional EMP Commission study warned back in 2008 that if our electric grid, which is so vulnerable, is taken down, 90% of Americans could die. Congress did absolutely nothing then, or in the decades since, to require utilities to harden the grid or to warn Americans of this fatal vulnerability our enemies are very well aware of. North Korea got help from Russia to design their nuclear weapons to be optimized to produce EMP effect. North Korea could destroy the United States, and Iran will likely have this capability soon. Our military does not have its own electric system. It is also dependent on our fragile civilian electric grid. If China wants to invade Taiwan, they can take it without U.S. interference by simply taking out our electric grid before they invade. Our military at that point becomes low-tech and largely powerless. It's the obvious Achilles heel for the United States. It's an absolutely fatal flaw, and it will be surprising if this weakness is not exploited by our enemies to destroy us. Indeed, even if we made the decision now to harden the electric grid, in the years it would take to do so, we must expect that Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, or some dedicated terrorist group will execute an attack to take it down rather than lead this fantastic opportunity to easily destroy the United States. If we survive and recover, there should be a tribunal for criminals like we had a Nuremberg trial after World War II, but not for the foreign enemies who took the grid down, but for the elected officials who for decades have known about this fatal vulnerability and done nothing to fix or address it. If you think I've exaggerated the vulnerability of our electric grid and that 90% fatality warning given by this congressionally funded EMP commission, or the irresponsible criminal misconduct of our government in failing to do anything about it, then watch this award-winning documentary about the grid. It's called Grid Down, Power Up. If you were aghast at how the US government gave money to China for them to do gain of function viral research in Wuhan, then you'll be even more appalled to know that our government also did this gain of function research to successfully develop a mammal to mammal transmissible version of H5N1, a 60% lethal virus. Researchers were able to get ferrets, a mammal with a respiratory system similar to humans, to incubate H5N1 and developed a variant of H5N1. The very worst thing they could possibly do because it was air transmissible between the ferrets, mammals like us. But here's the worst thing. They published how they did it, explained the fairly simple procedure they used, so any country or small terrorist group or even one dedicated individual can use this technique to develop a human-to-human transmissible version of this highly lethal virus. Biologists who wrote this article noted that while the 1918 pandemic, which was just 2% lethal, killed 50 million, H5N1, 60% lethal, could kill 1 billion. And it's important to understand that while the virus may directly kill 1 billion people, the collapse, the loss of law and order that results, the no economic production, and mass starvation could probably kill far more, potentially several billion may die. The H5N1 virus, which was previously called avian or bird flu, continues to spread into more mammal populations. The 2024 human cases in the U.S. are not from human to human transmission of H5N1, but the risks of H5N1 are huge and quickly getting worse. H5N1, which historically, again, has been about 60% lethal to humans, recently had a major mutation, enabling it to spread more easily in mammal populations. It's now spreading in more than 200 different mammal populations. These mammals serve as mixing vessels, helping the H5N1 virus spread to new species and eventually to humans. In March 2024, the U.S. had its first case of goats with H5N1. Then the virus infected dairy cattle. We've now had humans infected with no contact with animals in the United States. The current version of H5N1, Clade 23444b, is considered a new monster by scientists. The Collapse Survivor mobile app issued a threat warning alert on this H5N1 mutation and its expanding spread in mammal populations, warning that it could become human-to-human transmissible at any time. H5N1 is a huge, looming collapse disaster. Ray Dalio, the founder and CEO of Bridgewater, one of the largest and most successful hedge funds, made his fortune by correctly predicting future events. A year ago, he estimated a 30% chance of a civil war following the 2024 presidential election, when the losing side may engage in some violence, some states may succeed or break up, some form of civil war could break out. This was simulated in a Collapse Survivor app training exercise. Dalio now estimates a more than 50% likelihood of some kind of U.S. civil war post-election, since our nation is so deeply, irrevocably divided. While the likelihood of civil war-like violence is high post-election, this is unlikely to yield a collapse, meaning the economy is not functioning and widespread loss of law and order. Our experts that were consulted for the probability of collapse model update believe that while some states may split up and Texas and some conservative states may succeed if the Democratic candidate wins, this is unlikely to result in armies clashing or a collapse. It's not impossible, but we estimated a 2 to 5% collapse risk from a civil war. There are a lot of brilliant people in many private and government-funded groups and studies that estimate the likelihood of particular collapse disaster threats like a civil war. We have provided you backup slides that summarize some of them. What the probability of collapse model does is cover all of these different trigger events, along with an estimate of whether or not the disaster trigger event expands and escalates into a collapse level disaster. We know of no other model that provides this estimate. The director of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University believes we face a high likelihood of an existential collapse. This means a collapse so severe that our species is almost wiped out. the vast majority of humanity killed, and survivors and civilizations so badly damaged that it takes several generations to recover. Not years, but decades or a century, or potentially no recovery. Professor Nick Bostrom at Oxford estimated that the probability of an existential collapse disaster is greater than 25% this century. The probability of collapse model does not differentiate between the severity of a collapse, but a 25% plus probability of a very severe existential collapse that we cannot recover from, we believe is a reasonable estimate. The probability of collapse may be much higher than what the model calculates because you do not need to have a disaster trigger event to get a collapse. If enough people start looting, it's easy to overwhelm police and escalate out of control. This has happened in the US in recent years, and it happened in the United Kingdom in 2011, with 4 days of uncontrolled violence, looting, and murders across the country. Our society, the United States, has a lot of bad people who don't need an excuse to loot and maraud. A collapse could occur without a trigger event. Looting just starts and spreads. We've seen this for years now. From Baltimore to Portland, we've seen widespread, uncontrolled looting that overwhelms police capability. Millions of bad Americans are ready to loot and maraud whenever they see an opportunity to take advantage of police being overwhelmed, as they are when there's a big protest event or a big disaster or civil violence. Indeed, our country is arguably in a mild form of collapse now. There are flash mobs that spring up so often they don't always make the news. Looting is so blatant and widespread in California, with big groups breaking into Home Depot or department stores, hauling carts full of goods out in broad daylight. And this can happen anywhere if you tie up dozens or hundreds of policemen with crowd control in a protest or a political event or civil unrest. There are lots of bad people who know they can start looting, and there just aren't enough policemen to respond. When any big disaster strikes, police will be completely overwhelmed, and it will be open season for gang members, looters, joined later by millions of good Americans who turn to looting and, if necessary, killing to avoid starving to death. In March this year, we were running a Civil War simulation on the Collapse Survivor app, and in our scenario, violence got so bad in this simulation that the National Guard had to be mobilized to back up police. The amazing thing is that while this Collapse Survivor app exercise was training simulation of a Civil War was running, it actually happened. New York did call up the National Guard to back up police due to increasing violence and attacks and the subway system that the police could not handle. In good times today, there are not enough police. So imagine how bad it will be during a collapse when a real disaster hits and you're trying to survive in a city or a big suburb. There will be no police to help you in a collapse. There are at least 1 million known gang members in the United States, and they are likely to start marauding and killing when law and order fails during a collapse from the first hours of a collapse. 1 million gang members is probably a low estimate. We likely have far more gang members today because of our largely open borders. Some gangs, like MS-13, which started in El Salvador, are particularly brutal and pose a grave threat when law and order vanishes in a collapse. In addition to gang members, the 2 million Americans in jail are a big threat when a collapse starts. If the grid goes down, there is no way you can run a prison, a modern prison, without electricity. The generators they have there will only operate for a few days before they break down or run out of fuel. If there is a pandemic, prison guards aren't going to be coming to work. They're going to have to stay home to take care of their families, protect them from marauders. So most prison guards are eventually going to decide they're not going to go to work, so you won't be able to keep prisons operating. And it's not just in a pandemic, any kind of a collapse disaster where looting and marauding gets out of hand. Don't expect people to go to work. Don't expect guards to go to prisons. The 2 million Americans in jail are either going to get released or they're going to break out if a collapse occurs. It is disgraceful that our government has no plans on how they are going to handle the 2 million Americans locked up in jail in a collapse. I have worked in government from the county to the federal levels, dealing with our top planning scenarios, and there are no plans or even an honest admission that this is a problem that we need to prepare for. I encourage the media to contact the Department of Homeland Security. Ask states and counties, what is the plan to deal with prisoners when the grid is down and the diesel generators run out? Do you plan to release them? How are you going to control a jail if guards aren't coming to work? You're going to find out they have no plans for this at all. If you're thinking things can't be this bad or people would be taking action on these threats and problems, well, there are a lot of warnings, but few are paying attention to them, and the media rarely covers warnings. They wait to report on the events. Nassim Taleb, one of the smartest men alive today, author of The Black Swan, The Impact of the Highly Improbable, noted that people by nature ignore warnings of pending black swan disasters. We don't want to think about such disasters, and people are especially blind to new types of threats today because we rely on probability estimates, and you simply cannot calculate the probability of an event that has never occurred before. You can assess and estimate the likelihood of a new disaster from new technology or change conditions happening, but people usually refuse to consider such warnings until they've seen the disaster occur. As Taleb put it, we are suckers for black swan events, even when in retrospect it seems obvious that they were coming. Winston Churchill warned of the Nazi threat for years, and there was evidence aplenty of both Japanese and German military buildups and ambitions. But people didn't want to think about that, and they ignored it. We tend to underestimate both the probabilities and the damage. When there is a new technology or a new threat with no historical data to calculate the probability of it, you must not ignore it. And worst of all, you must not assume it's a low probability because it hasn't happened yet. But it's human nature to do just that. And that is why this probability of collapse model is so important. It assesses 49 disaster trigger events and then uses experts to estimate the likelihoods, most of which have no statistical basis but are not low and must not be ignored. Low probability predictions are deceiving. They imply no low probability events never happen. Rare events, low probability events do occur, but you usually can't predict when. The historical probability of a nuclear bomb that could wipe out a city was zero until we dropped one on Hiroshima. President J.F. Kennedy estimated that there was between a 33 and 50% chance of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is the same way with nanotechnology, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and many others. Do not assume that there is no possibility of a disaster or a low possibility of a disaster from these new technologies. They are going to deliver a huge disaster. It will happen. The only thing that's uncertainty is the timing and the severity. Experts who contributed to this 2024 update of the probability of collapse model believe there is a very high probability that Russia or China could defeat the United States in a nuclear war and achieve valuable gains that they consider well worth the cost because of the following two circumstances. First, leadership that is prepared to be ruthless has major advantages over a U.S. president that is more compassionate and concerned about minimizing civilian casualties. Second, our military is not prepared for tactical nuclear combat. We've long ago abandoned the capability and the weapons and the training, and there is a virtual political prohibition to even talk about fighting a nuclear war. Too many congressmen are ready to condemn and attack any effort to even consider fighting a battlefield nuclear war. Russia, on the other hand, did not get rid of its battlefield nuclear weapons. It kept them, modernized them, increased them. China as well. In a battlefield nuclear fight on an EMP battlefield, Russia and China would do much better than the United States, and in the end, the U.S. president would back down in the nuclear war, accepting the losses overseas to avoid damage at home. Thus, while we may regard nuclear war as unthinkable and ridiculous, for other countries, it's not just a viable option, it's the best means they have to defeat the United States military, negating our conventional technology advantages and exploiting our political weaknesses. The experts who helped me update the probability of collapse model see the risk of Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine that could escalate to nuclear war with NATO and the U.S. as high, along with big risks of China and the U.S. having a nuclear exchange when China moves to take Taiwan, as they insist they will. North Korea's dictator with nuclear weapons that could destroy our electric grid and kill 90% of us is a huge risk that we face, but our government doesn't address. And Iran may have nuclear weapons soon, or they may already have nuclear weapons that we don't know about. Another bad error made in estimating the probability of future nuclear weapons use is assuming that future nuclear weapons builders will have to enrich uranium with techniques the U.S. used back in the 1940s. We must not assume that technological advances won't generate additional, cheaper, easier means that are harder to detect of manufacturing weapons grade nuclear material. New methods to enrich uranium with lasers have already been developed, and with artificial intelligence, we must expect that not just countries, but terrorist groups or a company or even one dedicated individual will have the capability to enrich uranium in a new fashion that's easier to do, not the 1940s centrifuge approach. The probability of nuclear weapons use is high, and it's definitely going to rise. We can't calculate the probability based on past events, but we can be very certain it will rise, and it's completely irresponsible for our government to not warn people of this and urge preparations to deal with nuclear war and radioactive fallout. If at this point you're desperate for some good uplifting news, I can offer this. I believe the global warming problem will be solved. With billions of humans killed and economic activity, certainly large manufacturing, stopped during a collapse that could last for years, the man-made increases in temperature and pollution will plummet. While this is admittedly a bit of humor, I am confident that some biologists and environmentalists will use CRISPR bioengineering technology and AI to develop a deadly virus to kill off billions of humans and, in their view, save the planet, making the moral argument that by killing 5 billion humans now, they can enable the lives of 5 trillion future humans and other creatures that have a right to life if they stop what they see as a huge, unjust destruction of the planet. I have seen an article by a biologist writing on biotechnology who referred to people as, quote, mammalian weeds, unquote, in describing human overpopulation from her point of view. Our government has done a horrible job, irresponsible, in preparing us to survive the coming collapse. Congress sponsors studies and hears testimonies from experts about collapse disaster risks, but then does nothing to act on the recommendations. The congressionally funded EMP Commission reported to Congress that our electric grid is a huge risk, must be hardened, and yet in almost 2 decades since then, since they issued the report, not a damn thing has been done. The utility lobbyists pay congressmen to not force them to harden the grid, and there is no big political donations for congressmen from citizens who want to have electricity and survive a collapse. We don't even have a government that is willing to warn people honestly about the risks. Elected officials want citizens to believe that they are safe and well protected, that they're doing their job great. There is no civil defense program for U.S. citizens, no stockpiled food like we started to do in the Cold War. Government facilities for top elected officials and government people, they do exist. We've got Raven Rock and the huge Mount Weather Survival Complex near Washington, D.C., that has had massive construction and expansion in recent years. But for American citizens, there are no preparations nor honest warnings of the high growing risks of a collapse disaster that could kill a large percentage or almost all of our population. It's reasonable to ask, if these threats are so bad, why isn't the government warning us about this? Again, career politicians are focused on re-election, and they get big donations from utilities, corporations, and big university lobbyists who love gain-of-function research. There is no lobby group that donates money to improve preparedness. Government officials also prefer to have a dependent public that follows their direction and trusts them to know what's best and will protect them. They don't want to panic the public or to look ineffective. They want citizens to trust that government knows best and will keep them safe. Just pay your taxes and re-elect them. Improving preparedness means citizens with AR-15s and ammunition to fight off marauders. The Democratic Party is not going to support that. And improving preparedness also means the end of a lot of government regulations and government jobs today, because so many government regulations, building codes, zoning restrictions, bans on getting antibiotics, bans even on wood stoves, the only reliable means of heat and energy in a collapse. That's what government promotes, not preparedness. Government isn't just failing to warn of collapse threats, they are the biggest and worst barrier to prepare for survival. And again, for their survival, they're taken care of. Congress will be safely sheltered at Mount Weather and other FEMA sites. The priority of government at all levels is, quote, continuity of government, unquote. That's official government policy. Anytime there's a disaster, police, military assets will be surged to protect the government officials. Less people will be available to help citizens when a disaster occurs. Government prioritizes itself, it does not prioritize protecting citizens. Because of advances in biotechnology and the dangerous gain of function research that the U.S. government has funded to develop more deadly and transmissible viruses, the former director of the Center for Disease Control recently warned that a human bioengineered H5N1 virus is likely to cause a horribly deadly pandemic. The CDC is irresponsibly labeling H5N1, quote, low risk, unquote, when the mutating, spreading H5N1 virus is one of the greatest threats we face today. Other experts, not politically constrained, regard H5N1 as an inevitable, disastrous pandemic that we are not prepared for and cannot avoid. Some country, terrorist group, or individual will probably make and release a deadly variant of H5N1 or some other new bioengineered virus. The CDC must stop lying, admit that H5N1 is not a low risk, it's an extremely large risk, likely to cause a pandemic and collapse that could kill most of us. The big lessons from this probability of collapse model update and the presentation today are summarized on this slide. Again, the probability of collapse disasters is high and it's rising. The initial disaster may not be what kills you, but the collapse, the loss of law and order, the loss of food production and delivery, and the marauder attacks that occur after law and order vanishes. Irresponsible government is not preparing for a collapse. Citizens need to work on their own if they're going to survive. We need to be preparing for it. I can take some questions for you. Sorry about that. The phone was turned off. The camera. I have some time for questions and appreciate you attending today. Yes.
How do you think a civil war will play out?
If you didn't hear that, a question was, how do I think a civil war would play out?